Returning to the California State Road Museum in Sacramento, he just recently retired, so he returned and left. As the museum's curator of history and technology and as historian for the Capital District State Parks. Kyle's topic today is, as mentioned, the narrow gauge cars built by the Virginian Truckee shops. Kyle, where are you? There you are, all wired up and ready to go.
Yes. So theoretically, this is working?
Not very well.
Not very well. That works better. Okay. So I have to talk into my shirt collar.
Talk into your elbow like a Secret Service man.
Yeah, right. Okay. We'll try this and see how this works. So this is a presentation. It started off as a presentation looking at narrow gauge cars built in the V&T shops, and along the way I got interested in the trucks that went under narrow gauge cars, freight trucks. And so this whole presentation sort of evolved, and so we'll do a fair portion on trucks, and then we'll get into the cars themselves. So also I wanted to briefly review the other builders of narrow gauge cars that are out here in the West, and other cars. So for instance, there's Casebolt, who built some early cars and locomotive bodies in San Francisco. The lower left one is known to many of you as the Flea. It was built for the Napa Valley Railroad and then went through a series of other owners. Ultimately, Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber used it. But Casebolt also built a number of other cars, including city cars, but also full-size railroad cars. They also built some of the dump carts for the V&T when it was being first built. Kimball, of course, is well known. Built a number of passenger and freight cars, standard and narrow gauge. We'll return to what a Kimball freight truck was actually like in a little bit. But they had a large factory in San Francisco, but something about overbuilding and under too much building and not enough jobs. So they didn't last very long. Carter Brothers had a much longer run, built a lot of passenger and freight cars that were used around the western U.S., also standard gauge cars. Hammond, John Hammond's California Car Works, built a number of narrow gauge freight cars, also some passenger cars, both standard and narrow gauge, and examples of those survive. Holman started out working as the foreman for Hammond, and then went out on his own and built a number of cars, mostly standard gauge cars. And all these folks were also building street cars or cable car bodies and things like that, and horse cars. The Central Pacific shops in Sacramento built a number of standard and narrow gauge cars. Here's some examples of some of the standard gauge cars that were built. They also built a number of narrow gauge cars for lines that they had acquired, such as the South Pacific Coast and others. So there were a number of those, and a lot of times these get confused with Carter cars. So for instance, on the South Pacific Coast, Carter built a lot of the cars, but then the SP shops started building the cars themselves in the 90s, and there gets to be confusion as to who actually built which cars, because the designs were a little bit different. And we'll get more into that in the trucks also. And then, of course, the V&T shops built a number of standard gauge cars as well as narrow gauge cars. We often talk about them rebuilding flat cars, but basically what that meant is you burn all the wood, you take the metal parts, put it into a big bin, and then you build new flat cars, drawing the parts that you need out of the bins. And so you can argue whether there's actually a lineal descent of actual cars, that you can trace one number to the rebuilt next number, or whether it's just really a new car that uses some hardware. Inside the shops, there was the car shop was one portion, which would be where they would be doing a lot of the woodworking. They also had the machine shop and the foundry and pattern shop, and then of course the engine house portion of the shops. Photo inside the car shop portion. The upper left photo shows one of the Kimball coaches being serviced. The lower left view was taken in, I think it was December of 1990, just shortly before the shops were taken down, and it's roughly the same view. These are looking at the same area of the shops as they looked at the very end. The V&T standardize on design of their cars and produced this drawing, which was then sent to Detroit, I believe, for a number of cars built there to these drawings. The standard V&T cars. They had earlier, of course, purchased cars from Kimball and from the Central Pacific. So they had some experience with flat car designs as they drew these drawings up. And these drew a lot of inspiration from earlier cars. So, as I say, I want to talk a bit about the evolution of trucks and styles of trucks and designs of trucks. Central Pacific had a number of different designs of trucks, and the V&T copied basically several of the designs. So on the far left-hand side is what I refer to as the 1860s truck. That's also in the flat car view. And then on the far right is what we call the California truck, which was a swing motion truck. And that's on the far right of the photograph. And then in the center is the all-iron Thielsen truck. And Thielsen was a patented design. The Central Pacific had their own detailed version of that. Carson, Colorado, of course, also purchased Thielsen trucks for a number of their cars. And so we come across those on the narrow gauge. The earliest design is a very interesting design where it had 3 spring clusters. Not only did it have spring clusters out at the side, but it had an additional spring cluster in the center because it's the bottom plank that is trussed to carry the weight, not the top one. And so they had to be able to transfer the load from the flat car from the upper transom down to the lower transom. And so they had to have a spring cluster in the center, right there, in addition to having the side spring clusters. So this is the design of the 1860s Central Pacific trucks, and the V&T initially copied this design. Here's some pictures of one of the V&T trucks, my kid a number of years ago. And then here you can see on the inside, again, here's the center spring cluster in addition to the side clusters for this design. Interestingly, I had always assumed from the other photos that the cars for the Carson and Tile Lumber and Fluming were all California trucks with swing motion. But looking closely at this Watkins shot, I discovered that that's basically that earlier style truck in a narrow gauge version. And some of these early cars were built by Detroit. Some other early cars, I believe, were built in the V&T shops. So I can't say who actually built those trucks, but certainly they were in use early on the Carson and Tahoe. A lot of other photos show the later trucks, but we'll come back to that. There are some other variations of these trucks, except that they use a truss on the top part so they don't have to have the center spring cluster. This is a Pennsylvania 1860s design. This is the Bill Myron Small narrow gauge truck called the Cleveland truck, which also has the truss on the top plank. This particular truck here was on the Nevada Central, so it's got Union Pacific style journal boxes. But there were others around that had other types of journal boxes. But this particular truck is over here in Carson City now. Kimball trucks. There have been a lot of discussions about what Kimball trucks, and in fact, a lot of people have assumed that the 1860s Central Pacific truck was, quote, the Kimball truck. Actually, that's the Kimball truck right there. And it is, in many ways, it's a throwback to 1850s design, 1840s and 50s. Davenport and Bridges was a major car builder in Massachusetts in the 1840s and 50s, and they patented this truck design. A similar design was also used even later under some tenders in the 1860s, but it was a freight car design initially, and I found this patent. So Kimball is actually picking up on that much earlier design and applying it initially. And from all accounts, it was not the most successful design on the B&T. Although it did last a while, because I think this particular set of photos, was that in the 90s, Stephen?
Yes, 91.
Yeah, so there was a derailment up on a trestle in Virginia City, and that's where these photos are sucked out of that, a photo of that from that wreck. The California truck, again, a patented design, and again, with different variations. The Central Pacific had their own details. The details would vary. The basic patent design would be licensed. So, oops, let's go back that way. Let's try that button. So this is the basic patent drawing style for the California truck. And this is the version that both the Central Pacific and the V&T used. They used a leaf spring in the center, and then a casting in the center between the two wooden transoms in order to hold their space out. The California truck was patented by Charles Allen, and he had a number of different versions. He had a 4-wheel, a 6-wheel, and an 8-wheel version. That lists some of the sources of information. So this is the patent drawings for the 4-wheel version of it, and this is the basis for the Central Pacific and the V&T truck. That's the 6-wheel and the 8-wheel version. Pullman used the 8-wheel version under some early Pullman cars in the late 1860s, very early 1870s, until they figured out that actually they were better off with a 6-wheel truck instead of the double bolstered 8-wheel truck. But some of the very early Pullman cars that came out to the Pacific Coast when the Central Pacific was completed had these 8-wheel trucks under them. This is possibly the first swing motion truck that I've been able to find so far. This dates from 1859. So swing motion itself was not a new idea at the time that Allen was patenting his California truck. It had been around for some time. The concept of swing motion truck is that it gives a smoother ride, and the thought was that that would be easier in terms of wear and tear. The problem was that there were so many moving parts and wearing surfaces that it did become somewhat of a maintenance-intensive truck. Passenger trucks typically are swing motion because you want the smoother ride. Many caboose trucks were swing motion. They thought that it was more efficient on freight cars also, and so between this and then the later Thielsen truck that we'll talk about, the idea was that the swing motion was more effective. And it wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that they started doing some tests and discovered that that wasn't necessarily true. But anyway, this is a classic example of the Central Pacific truck, and this is the one that the V&T also copied. Again, with this flat car drawing, it includes this California truck. And so this is a detail of what the V&T was looking at, which is very directly the Central Pacific truck design. And again, here's some pictures of the V&T trucks, the California truck design on a number of cars that are surviving and restored. One of the details to note on 19th century truck is typically on the edges, they would chamfer the edges. And most of the time when these get renewed in restorations and all, they don't pick up on that detail. And so the edge, for instance, this is a replacement beam, and you can see that it's a very square corner as opposed to having that chamfered edge, which actually reduces splitting and other things like that. So some other close-up details, you can see the swing links in here. So the design is that the swing links are hung off of these two transoms. The swing links come down, and then there's a spring plank down at the bottom that sits on these swing links so that the bottom transom can swing back and forth to absorb some of the motion. This is the narrow gauge version of the California truck, again on the Carson and Tahoe. These I'm pretty sure, well, they had some, again, Detroit-built cars as well as some V&T shops-built cars. But this is how that design was very directly translated into narrow gauge from the standard gauge. Here are some closer views, a detail out of one of Herman Darr's drawings of the early flat cars. This is the truck underneath what became the flanger for the SP narrow gauge, which was built on a 22-foot V&T shops built flat car. There are other examples of California trucks. So for instance, this is one of the V&T Wells and French hay cars. That's a California truck, but it's not like the Central Pacific in details. It's actually closer to the patent drawings that Allen had for the original California truck design. Carter trucks are California trucks essentially. The one difference is that in the true California truck design, oops, let's go back. The center section here has a casting, whereas Carter just put wood in there as the spacer to hold the two transoms in place. You can see here. So that's just a little variation. But essentially, the mechanical function of the truck is the same either way. Carter used trucks like these. Hammond had a similar truck, also standard gauge and narrow gauge. The Sierra Nevada wood and lumber flat cars, the standard gauge cars as well as narrow gauge cars, use a version of this type of truck right here with the wood spacer instead of the casting spacer. Then there's the Thielsen truck. The Thielsen truck was, again, a patented design. Both the California truck and the Thielsen truck came out of people that were working for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. Hans Thielsen fairly shortly went and became the master mechanic on the Northern Pacific. But he and a friend had patented this design while he was still on the Burlington. And again, there are a number of different variations in design. You can see these trucks are in many ways more similar to the trucks that the Carson, Colorado purchased for their cars as Thielsen trucks. Central Pacific had their own details of design for their own Thielsen trucks, which we'll see shortly. But lots of other companies used Thielsen trucks. Baldwin put them under a number of tenders. And about the same time, the Hewitt journal box with the sliding lid was also patented. So again, a lot of the Carson, Colorado cars, some of the early ones came with a flip journal box lid, but many of them had these Hewitt lids. Central Pacific very early adopted the Hewitt journal box, and so a lot of their freight trucks and passenger trucks used the Hewitt lids, and a lot of other companies also used the Hewitt lids. So interestingly, the office that was managing the patents for the Thielsen truck was the same office that was handling the patents for the Hewitt journal box. You can see the address is the same place. Again, so here are the patent drawings, the actual patent drawings for the Thielsen truck, and then the patent drawings for the Hewitt journal box. As I say, some of the Carson, Colorado used these flip lids early on, but a lot of them also then used the Hewitt lids. They bought different batches of Thielsen trucks. It wasn't a single order, it was a series of orders for those trucks. So some of the details that distinguish the Thielsen truck is that there's channel stock. Instead of the wood transom of the California truck, it's a channel stock that is used here. Again, there's a casting in the center, and it's typically riveted on all four sides. And then the other thing is that this middle arch bar is upset at the end to capture the end of the top. And that is not unique to Thielsen's, but it's very characteristic. It's one of the diagnostic features for a Thielsen truck design. And the reason I make such a point of this is that in the 1920s, teens and 20s, the Southern Pacific narrow gauge built a number of trucks that are loosely look like Thielsen trucks, but aren't really Thielsen trucks. And modelers for decades have referred to all of them as Thielsen trucks, and it just ain't so. There are a number of true Thielsen trucks that were on the SP narrow gauge in the Carson, Colorado, but there are a lot of other more modern trucks that were simply, they used the channels here, and they would just take a piece of channel and rivet it on the two sides for the centerpiece, and then they would torch out an opening in the center. Here's some more details of a Carson, Colorado Thielsen truck, true Thielsen truck, that still has its swing links on it. So you can see the swing link mechanism on the Carson, Colorado trucks. This is the Central Pacific and Southern Pacific had their own version. Again, they licensed the use of the Thielsen design. They had a lighter truck, a 15-ton truck, which had a smaller center casting. And then when they went to a 20 and 25-ton truck, they had a larger center casting like this. But all of these are Thielsen, true Thielsen trucks. You'll also notice here you have the Hewitt, at least on this side, the Hewitt journal box lid. This is a side bolted lid. Let's try that. Locked.
Should be good.
Hello. There. Okay, so here's a drawing of the Central Pacific, the lighter duty, the 15-ton Thielsen truck. And this drawing is at the California State Railroad Museum. I believe there's also a drawing of the heavy Thielsen truck there. In later years, they were specified for cabooses. So a lot of times after they had replaced the Thielsen trucks on freight cars, they continued to use them on cabooses because of the swing motion aspect of them. And in fact, there's one set of SP Thielsen trucks that survive. It's under a California Western caboose that's up at Roots of Motive Power in Willits. And it still has its swing links and everything. So this is a real live three-dimensional example of a Central Pacific heavy Thielsen truck. Again, these are some drawings of the true Thielsen trucks on the Carson, Colorado. Again, you can see the upset end capturing the top number. You can see the channels and then riveted on all four sides. This is one of the purchase orders for Carson, Colorado Thielsen trucks from Russell Wheel and Foundry Company in Detroit. So the interesting thing about Russell Wheel and Foundry is that their plant was literally out the back door of Detroit Car Works. The two companies were located adjacent to each other. And when you look, I've looked at some Sanborn maps of that area, and they're literally, they abut, the two properties abut. So they were right there together. And then, so here are some photos of SP narrow gauge trucks. Oops, let's go back. This one is again a true Thielsen truck, although the center casting has been replaced with a piece of channel. This, I suspect, was a Carter truck that got rebuilt, replacing the wooden transoms with iron transoms, but reusing the arch bars. And then this is what I refer to as a thick Thielsen. This is one that was built from scratch by the SP in the teens or 20s and was used under a number of freight cars at that time, replacing older trucks. And as I say, superficially, you might think it's a Thielsen. It's got the channels, but when you look at the ends, there's the end is not upset to capture that top member, and that's one of the key diagnostic features. As I say, other people also use Thielsen trucks. The Denver and Rio Grande use Thielsen trucks under a lot of their freight cars. This is a Rio Grande drawing of a Thielsen truck. And here's a couple of surviving examples of a Denver and Rio Grande Thielsen truck. This is down at Boulder City, Nevada State Railroad Museum in Boulder City. And there's don't know how they ended up in southern Nevada, but this set of trucks, which are marked DNRG-RW for railway, are true Thielsen trucks. So in 1888, the master mechanic A.J. Stevens at the Central Pacific died and was replaced by a man of in many ways, much less innovative and much more conservative tactics, H.J. Small, but he was also very much into testing. So in 1889, he took two train sets, one which had a set of Thielsen trucks, swing motion trucks, and the others of which had a version of rigid trucks. And he ran a series of tests with dynamometer cars on a hill so he could compare the two. And much to his surprise, not only did he find that the rigid truck had less wear and so less maintenance, which was expected. On top of that, they also discovered that they pulled better, that there was less rolling resistance from the rigid trucks. And that was an unexpected result. So H.J. Small designed what I refer to as the Central Pacific, Southern Pacific 1890 style rigid truck. And here is the bolster again with the truss rods on the transom on the top piece, and then springs on the side above the plate. And these trucks were used extensively on the Central Pacific in the 1890s, especially early 1890s. There was an article, an interview of H.J. Small in 1890, and he talked about the test that he did when he arrived in Sacramento, comparing swing motion versus rigid, and that the rigids were not only cheaper to make and maintain, they also performed better on the track. And as I say, that was the surprise, that they, even in the area where the swing motion was supposed to be better, the rigid trucks proved to work better for them. So here are some builders' photos of Central Pacific and Southern Pacific cars with the rigid trucks. Again, what I call the H.J. Small style truck right here, and a variation of that here on this Oregonian car. Very similar to the old Cleveland truck from the 1860s. These are drawings of the narrow gauge version of the truck. Now, traditionally, modelers have referred to this as the NCO truck, because a lot of Nevada, California, Oregon cars that came down to the SP narrow gauge had these trucks. But the design didn't originate with NCO. It was actually a Central Pacific design. A lot of the narrow gauge freight cars that were being built in the 1890s for the South Pacific coast in the Sacramento shops had this design truck on them. So the NCO simply picked up the design and used it, and then their cars came on down to the Owens Valley. But it's not truly an NCO truck, it's truly an SP truck. And again, here are some photos of one of these trucks. This is one of the cars at the California State Railroad Museum up on the trestle. This is the tank car, I believe, and it has one of these trucks that's been restored. So that's trucks. So let's talk about narrow gauge cars that were actually built in the shops. Carson, Tahoe, Lumber, and Fluming probably got the first Carson built cars. There are some 22-foot flat cars that were built for the Carson and Tahoe, and some of the first flat cars built for the Carson in Colorado were 22-foot cars built in the B&T shops that subsequently were then sold to the Carson and Tahoe from the Carson, Colorado, after the Carson, Colorado standardized on 30-foot flat cars. So again, here's this view of up at Spooner Summit with some of the Carson Tahoe cars. This has, again, the early, what I call 1860s style truck on it. For comparison, this is a swing motion truck. That's a Baldwin tender truck under, I think that's the Tahoe or Glenbrook. And that's a swing motion truck that's a lot like the California truck. This is in fact one of those short CNC flat cars. This one has been turned upside down, so you actually get to see the bottom of it. Herman Darr did a nice drawing of it. And these cars were later sold to the Carson and Tahoe secondhand. But the Carson Tahoe had also acquired some new of the same design. Again, the colorized version. Thank you, Andrew. And as I mentioned, The flanger on the SP narrow gauge was built on one of these flat cars, and converted and served in through, I don't know when this thing was finally scrapped. Probably it was scrapped after they closed the line out over Mount Montgomery. That would be my guess. So again, Carson Tahoe also had a number of cars with the California truck with the swing motion links. So here is a view up again at Spooner Summit. These were had been hauling up cordwood or hauling up lumber for the send down the flume down Clear Creek. So here you can see both with the lumber loads and with the cordwood loads on these. This is down at South Shore at Bijou. This is the pier where they're running the logs out and dumping into the lake to haul then up to Glenbrook. And again, you can see the California trucks here with the swing motion and wooden transoms. And again, a nice colorized version of these cars. I believe some of the Detroit cars came in this freight car yellow before getting the later freight car red. The interesting thing in this picture, especially the lower photo, you can see both types of trucks under these various flat cars, and you can see differences in the construction of the flat cars. So these are the ones with the California trucks, and these are earlier ones with the old 1860s style truck. The V&T shops also built a whole series of cars for the Bodie and Benton, Bodie Railway and Lumber, or the various names that operated under. This is one page out of the order for the cars, and it specifies everything that went into the cars. It's about 3 pages of information that details out everything that went into building the cars for the Bodie Railway and Lumber Company. And then this is some drawings that have been produced more recently. One of these cars more or less survived and was taken up by a group and rebuilt. And this is the car as rebuilt and displayed. Although the trucks are not original. I don't believe that car had trucks. I'm not certain on that. But the flat car itself, I think, had been turned upside down and was found and salvaged and rebuilt. It's down at June Lake on display. And then there's the Carson, Colorado 30-foot flat cars, which became their standard size flat car. And again, you can see a number of examples of that car design. Some of these later got built into gondolas or built into stock cars, and so there are a number of examples that still exist of these cars. Here's a set of fairly detailed drawings of the car, what it looks like. And a Herman Darr drawing of one of these cars as it was later on the SP narrow gauge. And some other drawings that have been made of these cars. This particular one is as rebuilt by the SP, and it has a variation of the SP built trucks under it, not the true Thielsens. They also built a series of box cars for the Carson, Colorado in the V&T shops. They built a couple of really long hay cars. The thing about hay is it's relatively lightweight for the volume, and so they could build a much longer car because the amount of weight being carried by the car wasn't all that great when they would fill it with hay, as opposed to, say, iron castings. Then they built a series of standard 30-foot flat cars. The hay cars were 40-foot, so that's unusually long for a narrow gauge car. But they built a number of standard 30-foot flat cars, probably the same basic frame as was used, or box cars, probably the same frame as was used on the flat cars. One of the cars was converted in 1888 into a refrigerator car, half of which still survives today. We don't know what the original design that they were following was, but based on what's left, it may well have been a good old patent design, which has roof hatches and a roof tray for the ice, and then the end vents, which certainly survive on the surviving car. You can see the end vents. This car in SP days was converted back into a box car, and so all the refrigerator, ice pans and everything would have been removed. And then, as I say, half of the car itself was up on a mountaintop in downtown Nevada. They also built a group of combination cars. Modelers have often referred to these as ventilated cars, and technically the railroad referred to these as combination cars because they were a combination boxcar and stock car. So with the vents were so that they could carry livestock in these cars. The Central Pacific also had ventilated, combination cars. In fact, the V&T had 5 Central Pacific built combination cars of an outside braced design. The Carson, Colorado had several variations of these cars. You can see the number of vent openings varies, some other details vary from car to car. So it's not just one series, but there are several iterations of that design that were built in the V&T shops for the Carson, Colorado. So again, here's some other additional photos of some of these cars. The one on the lower left is in maintenance away service or construction train service. The upper right one, I believe, is at Laws. And again, Herman Darr did some preliminary drawings of a couple of the different variations of these cars. And then this is one of the CNC combination cars as modernized by Southern Pacific. Southern Pacific, of course, built their own stock cars using flat cars as the basis. And so they took the combination cars and closed them in as just full box cars. And of course, the V&T shops also built some other cars. They built 2 cars as cabooses, or originally intended as cabooses, for the Carson, Colorado. Caboose number 1 survives down at Laws as a body, sitting on a set of trucks. In the 1890s, it was converted into a mail car. And so they added a second little ventilating clear story here so the car wouldn't be quite so hot, in addition to the cupola here, to give a little bit of ventilation for the postal workers working in the car at that time. They built a second one. This one had a half clear story, but very quickly this car was converted into a private car for the railroad officials, and so there's actually an interior view inside the car as a private car, and this is a picture of it in private car service. They built a third car that originally was intended to be caboose number 3, but it didn't have the cupola on it, so they instead numbered it as combine number 7, and so it was in service. It was vaguely styled after the Detroit combines on the V&T, although not all that closely. But I think there was some inspiration, particularly with the double curve on the roof. And then in the 1890s, they built a new private car, which was number 10. And it had both narrow gauge and standard gauge trucks, so that it could operate on the Virginia and Truckee as well as on the Carson, Colorado. It was longer than the earlier cabooses, but still had the half clear story and the cupola in it. When Southern Pacific took over the line, they rebuilt it fairly early, taking out the cupola and modifying it. They also gave it a name, and they named it the Esmeralda. So we know it by that name, but that's a name that was added after Southern Pacific acquired the line. In fact, the superintendent on the SP narrow gauge wrote to Yarrington talking about wanting to name the car Esmeralda, and that he thought that Yarrington would enjoy and think that name appropriate for the car. So this is a floor plan of the car as rebuilt. No, that's before the rebuild. So this is when it still has the cupola, and you can see the seats and all for the cupola. And then as rebuilt, this is the car card for the car from the SP collection. And this details from the teens or 20s the history of the car and work that was done on it. And there are floor plans for the Esmeralda after it was converted. I guess I didn't put those in. Finally, there's a mystery locomotive. The Sierra and Mohawk was an intended narrow gauge that got started and didn't quite make it. Ultimately, it became the Sierra Valleys Railroad in a later iteration. But as the Sierra and Mohawk, they actually had the V&T shops take what we believe is a standard gauge locomotive and convert it to narrow gauge for operation on the railroad. But apparently they supplied the wrong injector. They supplied an injector intended for a traction engine, not for a locomotive. And so the Sierra Valley and Mohawk contacted the V&T asking them for the correct injector. We don't know what they rebuilt, but one guess is that there were a group of standard gauge Union Iron Works built 060 locomotives in the coal mines down by Mount Diablo. And at the time that this locomotive was being converted was just about at the same time that some of the coal mines were closing down. And so it's possible that one of these locomotives was converted to narrow gauge. But that's a guess, that we don't actually have any direct information. So that's my talk on V&T shops and building narrow gauge equipment. Any questions?
Alan, who patented the design you referred to as California style, was he associated with a California firm, or do you know anything?
I believe it was called the California truck because they were commonly used out west. And I think that that's where the name comes from. They weren't exclusively used out here, but they were commonly used out here, and I think that's where the association came from. He was in the Midwest.
Yeah, do you know where he had worked?
Well, I think he had some associations with Pullman. Thus, his 8-wheel truck gets used under the Pullman cars in 1869, early 1870.
Wondering what the connection was. Thank you.
Yeah.
You had one picture in there that indicated it was from Travel Town. Is that the Travel Town down in Southern California?
Yeah, that is. So I photographed some of the narrow gauge cars down there and some of the trucks, and so
Okay.
it was a convenient set of photos.
Well, the Carson and Tunnel Lumber and Treating Company, I've heard sometimes the trucks that are called bliss trucks. I assume that they're probably just a variation on the California Island truck.
I believe that that's the, so he's asking about the Carson and Tahoe trucks being called bliss trucks. And I think that that's the California truck that is being referred to, the narrow gauge version of the California truck. Because that's the initial use of those trucks on narrow gauge is on the Carson and Tahoe, which is the bliss lines. So I believe that that's how that name and association comes in.
Are the pseudo-Thielsen trucks, are they rigid or are they still swing motion?
They're rigid. And in fact, a lot of true Thielsens were converted to rigid. The way that they converted the Thielsens was instead of where the swing links were, they would take a metal strap and just go down and come back up. So when they were built